The drawn curtains allowed rays of sunlight to settle on Fiona's face. She squirmed and stretched herself to consciousness. She blinked her lashes several times before plastering a smile and raising from the bed. Her mom stood by the bed, waiting for her as she did every morning. Fiona got off the bed and threw herself into her mother's arms, all too eager to start the day. Her mother ruffled her hair and played with her cheeks. That was Fiona's favorite part of every waking morning. Her mother hurried to her bathroom, and she rushed into the bath, excited. Words escaped her lips without stopping, and she failed at controlling her tongue until her mom snapped at her to keep quiet. She sealed her lips, but the truckload of words flew in uncertain directions, and she kept her mind busy thinking about various ways she could engage in the different conversations she wanted to. How could she keep quiet? She enjoyed talking, asking questions, and being everywhere, even at 5. But the day's excitement stemmed from another reason. In past weekends for almost 3 months, Fiona never missed the routine of begging her mother to take her along to the mall every time she shopped. But her mother responded with one excuse or the other. Fiona didn't know, but her mother lacked understanding of how to stop her from talking too loud or meddling with matters that didn't concern her. Fiona, since her birth, brought the interest of whoever came across her. Everyone called her pretty, savoring the uniqueness of her chubby cheeks and round face. Whenever people visited, they found it hard to separate themselves from Fiona when the time to go elapsed. Fiona knew all this because her mother had told her. She also remembered her mother warning her not to comment on every little thing. But Fiona couldn't control herself. Her mother must have given up when Fiona didn't listen, especially after the day she met a young woman when she and her mother took their dog, Scar, on a walk. The woman forgot to apply her lipstick correctly, or so Fiona thought. She hated the smugness on the woman's lips. Although she tried hard to look away from it, she couldn't. She busied herself by playing with Scar's fur, rubbing his head and back, and doing a little race back and forth. But when she looked up again after a while, she saw the woman again. Realizing that her body couldn't take it any longer, Fiona approached the woman without a second thought or asking her mother. She rushed and told the woman that her lipstick looked weird, and she wasn't supposed to wear it that way. She used her fingers to show the woman how to apply lipstick as though she were teaching a 2-year-old. She smacked her lips to demonstrate the method of even distribution. The woman stared at her, oblivious of what to say. The woman was embarrassed, and Fiona's mother was more embarrassed. Fiona could tell from the way her mother apologized to the woman 100 times after Fiona finished explaining the process of using lipstick. The woman smiled and walked away. When she seemed far from them, her mother scolded her and told her never to do such a thing again. Fiona couldn't tell what went wrong with what she did. No matter how the woman saw it, she didn't do it to be rude. She only wanted to help. That and her mother's words didn't make her sad. What made her sad was that her mother never allowed her to go on walks with Scar again. Not just that, her mother made her stay home most of the time and hired a babysitter to take care of her. She didn't let her go to the mall either, no matter how much she asked. However, that day, her wish would be granted. Her mother had agreed to take her to the mall. Her mother whisked her out of the bath, gave her a little shake, and pecked her forehead. She brought her back into the room and dolled her up in a jean miniskirt and shirt. She combed her blonde hair into 2 ponytails and wore a couple of wristbands for her. Fiona stood in front of the mirror when her mom finished. "I look very pretty, Mom," she said, and her mother nodded behind her. Her hand stood on her wrist, and she beamed with a smile that reached her eyes and could cause the hardest of hearts to melt. Her mother smiled back at her. "You have to promise me one thing, Fiona," she said. "Anything, Mother," Fiona responded, but her eyes remained fixed on the mirror and reflection. She thought her mother made a fabulous fashionista. She always chose the right colors and combinations. Her mind sauntered to the many times her mother chose clothes that made people keep looking back at her. She forgot her mother was talking to her until she mentioned her name. She froze in front of the mirror, realizing that she didn't hear a word of her mother's request. The request she promised to keep. "I'm sorry, Mom." She frowned and shaped her lips in a pout. Her mother's masked anger didn't fade. Shame filled Fiona's eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom," she repeated. "All I'm saying is you need to be well behaved today, Fiona. You can't go about correcting things or people or how they speak, or I'll never take you out with me again. Do you promise?" A tender smile spread across her mother's face, and the joy in her heart was restored. For a minute, she feared her mother would refuse to take her out. She was glad her mother didn't change her resolve because of that little mistake. "I promise," she said and smiled back. In her heart of hearts, she was determined to be on her best behavior and wanted nothing more than to keep her promise to her mom. It took so long to convince her mother to go with her. If she failed now, she would never know when next it would be. Maybe never. Fiona wasn't willing to jeopardize her one chance. Her mother smiled at her one last time and squeezed her cheeks. Fiona blushed excitedly and laughed when her mother's fingers reached her waist and tickled her. Some minutes later, her mother told her to relax and wait while she left to get dressed for the outing. Once her mother left, she searched for a sheet of paper. She had seen her mother write a list whenever she had some shopping to do. If she was going shopping, she needed a list of her own. So she took the extra time to draw a list of her own. She found a paper and pencil in her drawer, sat on her plastic chair, and started to jot down her list. She was halfway done when her mother called her from her room. She dropped the pencil, grabbed the paper, and ran to meet her mother. As they left the house, Fiona smiled at the giant portrait of her father in the sitting room. She waved at the picture every time she left the house and dashed out. She watched her mother lock the door, and she slipped into the car's back seat while her mother took the driver's seat. The journey to the mall ended as soon as it started. Fiona didn't know if she loved it that way or not. As much as she loved being on the mall's premises that fast, she also thought about sitting in the car while it drove a long distance. She imagined loving to take in the various sights on either side of the road of the small city. Nevertheless, the few things she saw gladdened her heart. Fiona figured something was wrong when her mother was driving in circles 10 minutes after arriving at the mall. No matter where her mother checked, she didn't get enough space to park the car. Cars filled the holes and corners of the left, right, front, and back. Fiona wondered why the mall contained that many people. The thought scared her as much as it excited her. Her mother brought the car to a halt many minutes later in a secluded area. Fiona figured the position where her mother parked the car ranked far from the best because she saw only the mall's entrance. The rest of the building disappeared from their view. Her mom killed the engine of the car and turned to face her. "I forgot, it's Black Friday, honey," her mother said. "What's Black Friday?" she said, and her mother shrugged. Her mind flipped, hoping her question didn't irk her mother. "Well," her mother started, and she relaxed. "Black Friday is when items, goods, and foodstuffs are sold at a lesser price. People take advantage of the price reduction and show up en masse. The mall will be crowded, Fiona. You won't like it. I won't be able to take you in with me," her mother concluded. "But Mom—" "Don't mum me, Fiona. You promised not to ask questions or defy my orders. You'll need to wait for me in the car," her mother said. She gave her an iPad and told her to play games in the car and talk to no one. Fiona watched her mother wind up the windows and lock the car. Her mother waved to her from outside and hurried ahead to the mall. She trailed her mother with her eyes, but saw only up to the mall entrance, where her mother stopped and laughed with a few other women. Although Fiona couldn't recognize them from such a far distance, she knew the women had to be her mother's acquaintances at least. Her mother never enjoyed speaking to many people, not unless she had something to get from them or she was friends. Her mother and the woman disappeared into the mall, and, disappointed, Fiona unlocked the iPad in her grip. She switched to one of her favorite games and would have been lost in its euphoria if the heat in the car didn't cause her head to spin. She didn't know why, but she felt dizzy, and her brain screamed for help. 5-year-olds found it challenging to understand the consequences of staying in a heated car in hot weather. If she were a little older, she would have figured the hot weather and the heat in the car didn't make a good combination. She checked around the car for something to kill the dizziness. In the front passenger seat, she found a basket containing a water bottle and some snacks. She drank some water and drowned in its relief. Having nothing else to do, she munched on some of the snacks in the basket. On several occasions, she glanced back at the mall entrance, hoping to see her mother coming her way. But in the troop that exited the mall every minute, nobody looked like her mom, and none of them came her way. Time elapsed, and after emptying the bottle of water she found in the car, Fiona's eyes twitched, and her head felt light. She could almost lift her head off her neck and place it by her side. Her stomach twisted in knots, and she suddenly wanted to be outside the car. And just at that time, she saw her father. He looked exactly the way he looked the last time she saw him. His beards were trimmed and neat. He stood outside the car, by the window close to her. The joy in Fiona's heart knew no bounds. If her mother chose to abandon her, at least her father would rescue her. His eyes shone with pride, and he smiled at her. Fiona's heart melted from her father's kind gesture and expression. She banged the window and asked him to help her out of the car. She wanted to hug him and tell him how much she missed him, how much she cried every day for him, and how much her mother missed him too. She wanted to ask him why he had disappeared for so long and didn't come back for her even once. But she needed to go outside to do all that. So she called him to open the door for her. He nodded in response and affirmed his presence with words that warmed her heart. Fiona had never been happier. She could remember the day her father left. Her mother received a strange phone call from an unknown number. Fiona could tell that the number was odd because it took her mother a while before she picked up the ringing phone. The only time her mother didn't pick up a call on the second or third ring was because she didn't have a clue who was calling. Fiona recalled the horror in her mother's eyes as she spoke to whoever called. Her mother soon dropped the call, carried her, and dashed off in the car to a hospital. Fiona didn't know what to expect, but her mother cried from the house to the hospital. A nurse directed them into a relatively cold room when they reached the hospital. Her father lay helpless on a slate, completely covered in white. Fiona didn't know why, but the feel of her father's skin on hers was cold. She asked her mother to explain the matter, but her mother buried herself in a conversation with her silent father. The horror for Fiona came when days later, people lowered her father into the ground in something her mother called a casket. Although she knew her mother didn't want to answer questions, she asked, because she wanted to know. To cut a long story short, her mother explained that Fiona would never see him again, save for the picture that was hung in their sitting room. However, her father stood here, trying to get her out of the car that seemed to be a prison. He pulled out the door and called her name. But at that time, Fiona couldn't respond anymore. She couldn't feel her body as she tried to drag the door handle one last time. She pulled and pulled, or at least she thought she did. Soon, she saw herself amidst the clouds and wondered if she had transitioned to heaven. She followed her mother to church on occasions when she did go, and she had heard of heaven. The clouds around her felt like heaven, so she allowed her eyes to close. She wanted to see more, but she was too exhausted. The next minute, everywhere became darkness. Light. Her eyes flickered open, and light flooded her iris. She closed her eyes again, and after another minute, she opened them. This time, besides her, she saw her mother. Her eyes looked swollen, implying she had cried for a long time. "What's wrong, Mom?" Fiona said, and her mother cupped her face. A new stream of tears escaped from her mother's eyes. "Why are you crying? Are you done shopping?" She followed up on her initial question. "I thought I would lose you. Why didn't you call for help? You always do. The doctor says you could have been worse if I found you later." Fiona stayed mute, oblivious of how to respond to her teary mother. "I only wanted to keep my promise to be a good girl, Mother. You said I had to keep to myself if I wanted to go out with you next time. And then I saw Dad." She settled on some words, but her startled mother scared her. "He's dead, Fiona." Her mother shook her head. "You couldn't have seen him, honey. You only imagined it," her mother said. "But I saw him. We spoke." Fiona's mind shrunk in confusion. She couldn't be more sure of what she saw in the car. "No, honey." Her mother didn't stop shaking her head. "You can't see him, remember? The only image of him that you can see is that portrait at home, the one you wave to every morning. You had a heat stroke, which must have triggered your imagination and brought your father to live in your thoughts. It's all fake, honey. You'll be fine." Her mother drew her into a hug, and although confused, Fiona savored the hug. She loved the assurance embedded in the hands wrapped around her. The doctor discharged her some hours later, and her mother brought her home. At home, she smiled at the picture of her father and came to terms with the fact that she wouldn't see him again. And also, if she ever did, she would be in a dangerous situation. Her mother gave her some food, and after eating, she slept. The next day, her mother took her out again. One would think her mother would learn never to leave her alone in the car in one situation. But the hunger that drove her mother to a restaurant carried away her mother's common sense. She told Fiona she would be right back and repeated the same actions the day before, wound up the windows and locked all doors. But Fiona was wiser. Just before her mother closed the doors, she opened one of the doors at the back, not wide enough to be seen, but unlocked for escape if she needed any. And a couple of minutes later, she needed escape. That's how she escaped another episode of heat stroke, by climbing out of the car and breathing in some air before returning when she saw her mother coming.